Hey, hi everybody. It's lovely to be here in conversation with you. So today we are here with Swapnaa Tamhane, Prasad, Bidaye, and Noor, Bhangu, all of whom are in conversation surrounding Swapnaa's exhibition at Hamilton Artists Inc., Drop Cloth, which recently closed here mid-May. And so my name is Swapnaa Tamhane. I'm the programming director here at the Inc. And today we're talking about Swapnaa's exhibition as well as her practice as a whole, through the lens of Drop Cloth, which is her exhibition thinking about textiles and the textile industry as it relates to mark making and community and many other wonderful motifs that we will explore together. So I'm going to turn the conversation over to you, Swapnaa, and to the rest of you to introduce yourselves.
Thank you, Sana. Thank you, Prasad and Noor, for being here, and Sana for organizing all of this. I'm really looking forward to this discussion and conversation. Yeah, the exhibition Drop Cloth. I guess there's sort of several parts to it that I've been working on for a number of years. So there are textiles, there are drawings. There's also a sound piece, which is something I really wanted to explore in this. And there's also a recycled plastic weaving, and a lot of my thinking is centered around, as you said, mark making, but also looking at this figure of Kabir, who is a born in the late 1400s weaver, poet, saint, mystic, which Prasad can also speak more about. So kind of looking at him as a sort of metaphor to thinking about mark making that can be created by a number of people, and thinking about drawing as not just a singular mark made by one person, but again, by a community.
Noor, why don't you go next?
So my name is Noor Bhangu, and I'm a curator and scholar based between Toronto and Oslo. And a lot of my work sort of explores ornaments, Orientalism, and post-colonial history. And that's why I'm really excited about Swapnaa's project, because I think you're approaching ornament in a very different way from how I've seen it. It's mostly like encoding how does ornament sort of conceal histories, but you're really opening it up and thinking about ornament as an archive. So I'm really excited for this discussion as well.
And my name is Prasad Bidaye. I'm a professor in the English department at Humber College in Toronto. I'm based in Milton, Ontario, but I consider myself part of the GTHA community. I am also a writer, a journalist, and I used to work in electronic music as a DJ and a performer. And I have I'm currently involved with the Indigenous Resistance Collective. I can speak, Swapnaa mentioned the sound piece, and Kabir. I did my PhD in English literature, focusing on South Asian studies and the pre-colonial context, especially Bhakti poetry. And with electronic music, I feel like I can speak both to those two pieces, the sound piece, but then also the religious context. I guess the one thing I'm a novice here with is that I'm in the large world of the arts, but not deep in the visual fine arts world. So I'm a newcomer on that side of things. So I guess in some ways I'm the outsider voice here, but I'm happy to be here.
Perfect. Okay. So maybe a place for us to jump into the conversation. I'm really interested in hearing about the relationship between this idea of drawing as a accumulation of marks and the textile practices in the work, and also like how the idea of mirrors relate to this. So maybe that's a place we can start.
Can I start? Do you want me to start over? Well, so the title Drop Cloth is really the thing itself. I am not able to share my screen for some reason. It's not from your, I think it's from my end. And the drop cloths are, just to give you like a little quick encapsulation of that work and where it's coming from, they're called achadias, and they are what is used on the print beds. So they basically absorb all of the excess print and residue, as the block printers are. So here you can see these are the achadias. So they basically just be like plain cotton, kind of like a thicker cotton that is used. So they're sort of pinned really tightly to like these long print beds. And those would be, what you see here is like slightly larger than what the print bed is. And then they're used for like this kind of accumulative printing process. So the block printer that I work with, Saleh Mahmed Khatri, who is an artisan designer based in Kutch in Gujarat, he and I, in this kind of process of working with him over many years, I really have come to love like the residue that's left. So these have absorbed the kind of motifs from my designs, which are all based on a building by Corbusier, the Textile Mill Owners Association building. And they also have his Adrak work. So Adrak is like it's particular to his village. And Adrak uses kind of a geometric patterning. And they dye primarily with colors like indigo, madder red, and blacks, and which are from sort of iron. So I asked Saleh Mahmed, in this process of working with him, if he could dye these in indigo, and I thought that would really like reveal all of those kind of residues and layers. And so that dyeing process kind of creates this something that I'm interested in is images that can potentially make themselves, and I feel like this is an example of that kind of way of thinking, in which you start to see the like my motifs along these Adrak motifs. And maybe you can find a detail, Sana. So what I've done is a bit of a call and response method, is to apply mirrors to the existing marks that are on the drop cloths. So I'm just sort of pulling out the lines that exist, or the kind of, the dots that exist. And I'm just kind of highlighting them with the use of mirrors. And what I love in that process is that it suddenly makes the textile into this, it's already three-dimensional, but it sort of makes it into this fourth or fifth dimension for me.
So I haven't seen the exhibition itself in person. I've only seen images online. And what I love is also like the mirror sort of like reflecting into the exhibition space. And I feel like with different elements of this project, you're really sort of like expanding the visual and playing with what's possible. So I was wondering like if you had it in mind, like how the mirrors might react in such a space.
Yeah, thank you for noticing that. So during, COVID lockdown in Montreal, we just moved into this apartment, and we have quite a large sort of front room. And I'd kind of taken over the whole space and turned it into my studio, much to my partner's delight. And just sort of like working late one night, I think I had like two little lamps on. We didn't really have that much furniture. We like literally had just kind of come into the space, and I like took my phone and this lamp and started playing around to see how the mirrors were responding. And then of course there's that like amazing kind of disco ball effect. But what's incredible is that refraction of light that just extends into all the corners. And I'm using circular mirrors. In some cases they're linear. And in some cases they are like little diamond shapes. And so you can see here that, so they just create like this kind of amazing environment that is totally unpredictable.
And I imagine for the visitor as well, like there's like an intimacy that, you're talking about this community of makers, this archive that holds this community together, and the visitors also get to sort of participate in that for the exhibition.
Yeah, and in one of the acharyas, which I didn't include in the Hamilton Artists Inc. exhibition, I had begun, I tried to teach myself how to do shisha embroidery, which is, again, it's particular to Rajasthan, but also to Kutch. And how it's done traditionally is they hold the mirror and they sort of embed the mirror in the cloth, and then they'll stitch around it, and the stitches secure that mirror in. So anyways, I tried to teach myself, but wasn't working. And so I've done this other sort of tactic of just drawing the threads over the mirrors. And again, those reflections, they create these like amazing sort of, I don't know if they're portals, but they look to me like microscopic images that also align with my my work when I make handmade paper. And I've been putting paper under microscopic images or under a microscope to see like how those fibers are binding. And so there was a kind of interesting alignment with that. In this case, at the ink, I've used really, really tiny mirrors that are, they're also, so the other thing that's interesting is that these mirrors are all machine made, and traditional embroidery or shisha kam is with handmade mirrors, which has a very different like effect. They're sort of bubbly, or they're kind of smoky, or they have like, they're not perfect. And these ones create a weird like opacity or kind of opaqueness when you look at them head on. But when you turn to the side, then you kind of see that like amazing glitter. Yeah, and the mirrors are really like, it's about that kind of creating like a surface of seduction. So you sort of get pulled into looking at it. And then thinking about, the way that ornament or decoration has been kind of derided in the West, like I'm trying to really actually pull everyone back into it and use that seduction as that kind of like method of like pulling you back into really enjoying the use of this application of mirrors.
And like when I've worked with like artists, like, using ornamentation in their work, it's, I think my thinking around ornamentation and like wanting to sort of give space to that in the 21st century after, loose and everything that came earlier, is to also think about how ornamentation also just holds and archives histories that shouldn't be accessible to everybody. So I love that there's like the mirrors are sort of working on two levels here, and that they're bringing people in, but you also mentioned there's like an opacity when you encounter the work in person. So yeah, that's really interesting as well, that there's this block.
These like this idea of the ornamentation is also coming from making a modernist building into a repeat print.
Yeah.
And having that sort of turned on its head in a way. But the use of the mirrors is also, I mean, in a way, the drop cloths are really, they're kind of an abstraction. They're abstract surfaces, and the use of mirrors is like, it's my way of, I guess, sort of highlighting these geometric lines and just pulling them out. But I'm also treating the entire surface. So these are, 8 meters, 0.25. I'm treating them as one composition and treating that as like, okay, if that was a piece of paper and I was going to draw on it, I'm using the mirrors as a way of drawing and of mark making. And really thinking about like this like layering of like residual marks and like what seeps through as the possibility for many people to make a drawing together. So what I'm considering as a drawing in quotations.
I have one quick question. Sorry, Prasad.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the building? Because you mentioned it a few minutes ago. I'm really interested in like this repetition of a modernist building, and yeah, could you talk about like why you selected this work? And yeah.
So these achadyas or drop cloths, they come out of another body of work called Mobile Palace, which Prasad has also seen. That was at the Royal Ontario Museum last year, and that work is based on taking this building that was commissioned by mill owners. So I was interested in, firstly, the philanthropy behind the mill owners, in that, you basically have an industry that was denied to Indians by the British during colonialism until the late 1800s. But then as we kind of move towards independence, then you have this sort of burgeoning in textile industry. And then you have enough wealth that you can commission someone like, the best architects from around the world to build you a private headquarters. So the Textile Mill Owners Association building, which is in Ahmedabad in Gujarat, it's a building that is like, Corbusier called it Le Petit Palais. It's really this kind of amazing, strange building that has there's no like closed front or back. It's totally kind of open. And I've taken those architectural motifs of like the brise-soleil or the sunbreakers and elements from around the building to turn them into these like motifs that are then carved by hand by woodblock carvers. And then of course printed by hand. So I'm thinking about the hand in relation to drawing, and all that kind of like, imperfect perfection that can transpire in all these different processes. So that is, and then turning that modernist building into a decorative second self. And Mobile Palace is really like, it's sort of a soft architecture, or a soft architectural interpretation of that concrete structure.
I think I need to do a bit more research on this one, but sorry for interrupting you, Prasad.
No problem. No, it's really interesting. I'm taking lots of notes here. I do want to go back to the disco ball effect for just a moment, because I had this, and I went to the exhibit, and I had this kind of revelatory experience, where we were looking at the cloth, we're looking at all the different images, and then suddenly we noticed the reflections of the mirrors on the walls. And it was this really magical moment because, the disco ball is a magical thing too, right? It's a form of ornamentation within a club setting. And in this type of space, it was interesting because, you're talking about, well, yeah, like it was a spontaneous, discovery, for myself, and but it also shifts the perspective because you go in thinking, okay, I'm going to look at the clock. You're not going in to think, oh, I'm going to look at the wall, and the beautiful part is because there's wind coming through the space. So when wind comes through the space, the cloth starts to move, the mirrors start to move, the lines on the wall start to move, these reflections start to move, and which is part, that spontaneity that you're talking about, Swapna, but then, which is motion. This is not a static piece, and it's even like, from an art perspective, you're thinking about, people often think about art as the object, but here it's not just the object, it's how this object is animating the room by like, by the actions that these mirrors, perform. And in their own way, they do create mark making on the walls of this space, and yeah, so I just wanted to because it does kind of, like we talk about, you talked about ornamentation and how it's derided in the West, and I've seen these textile pieces like all my life. This is just being South Asian. You've seen these like everywhere, right? If you see them in the home, they're just, you see them on pillows. You see mirrors on pillows and all that kind of stuff. It just becomes so ordinary and mundane. But it's one of those moments where a lot of people wear these types of fabrics. Let's say for example for festivals. And you wonder like why the mirrors is just like it's an ornamentation, but in this kind of moment, actually, if light strikes those clothes, suddenly those clothes animate the space in their own way, And so there's this, and that's the magic. I mean, that's a nice, it's magic in the sense that it creates an illusion, but it also reveals the illusion because you think it's just a piece of cloth, but no, the cloth is actually doing something, to the space, to the walls, and then to the, in my case, the viewer, because it's not what I was looking for. And it took discovery, it took noticing. It's not something I was even guided in the notes. Just wanted to put that out
there. I've always hated mirrors growing up, like on clothing. And I hated those like those kind of like tourist, quilts or whatever that were made in Gujarat. Like I just hated it, really resistant to it. And part of that was from like, being a student in art history and having, so I've gone through a process of having to unlearn my kind of hatred for that sort of decoration. And so there's two things I want to say. I'm trying to figure out what the order is. The first is that what you're saying, Prasad, and Noor, also what you're sort of saying is like this idea of like taking these things and putting them in an art space. So there's the idea of like, what do we value and how do we create value around this thing that is primarily made for, like domestic settings, is made for clothing. How do we celebrate block printing or this kind of process of block printing as a high art and as a unique piece of art? So each of these achadyas are completely unique. They can't be reproduced or repeated or put into commercial production, for instance. But if we look at block printing, we could think of it as a form of commercial production. And then the second part of that is that so going to Kutch, my first trip was in 2014, then 15, and then 18 when I started working with Saleh Mahmed. And I didn't really understand the mirrors until I went into some of the homes. And so I link back to thinking about architecture again. And so in these bungas or these mud homes, they have all the plates and cups and lotas and everything like in the ceilings. And I know this is definitely going to influence like future works. And it creates all this light. So the entire interior, which is actually quite dark, suddenly is now completely lit up. And then the exterior of the mud homes have something called lipenkam, which is mud mirror work. And so they embed mirrors on the exteriors of the homes. And then so you get like, I don't know, they look like spaceships. Like you get these like round structures that are completely refracting light in so many different directions, both inside and outside. And then the clothing, then you have all this clothing. So these women are wearing these amazing, like the long skirts that have, again, all that mirror embroidery. And there was, in 2020, I was there on my own and just, driving out to visit different weavers. And there was a group of women walking, and it was like a mirage. Like they just came and like they disappeared, and it was completely like in a sort of flattened desert landscape. When you see that, so that idea of refraction, I think, is really really key to how I'm thinking about using mirrors here. And then I saw so there's the Living and Learning Design Center, which is a new museum that's established by Shrujan, which has been at the forefront of like documenting all of these different embroideries. I saw this piece that was like just a little panel, and it had the tiniest mirror in it that I couldn't even detect it. But what I noticed instantly is that this piece of cloth it suddenly had several dimensions to it. And I couldn't understand like what was at the front or at the back. And so my relationship to thinking about that ornament through the mirrors has really shifted in spending time in that region and understanding like how they create light in these different, like in a desert environment. And then what you're saying, Prasad, like throwing it up against the wall, like having that sense of like, now there's a movement to another space completely. That is, it's like, there's so many different directions to go with it. And I have all these other sculptures in mind that are, I don't know. It's really strange for me because it's something that I would have completely resisted in my younger self. So anyway.
But I think it's a big part of the theme of the whole exhibit, that one walks in thinking, oh, okay, I'm looking at a cloth, but they have to, but spending time in the space makes you realize that there's actually other things happening. We talked about the mirrors, having this kind of magical effect and making us see the whole piece differently. But even like the I mean, yeah, like I said it earlier on, like a lot of people think, outside of the art world, especially, they think of art as object, right? And they think about it in terms of like, oh, okay, how was that drawing done? I'm supposed to appreciate how well it's done, its closeness to reality. But when I look at the piece, like the exhibition rather, all these different pieces are actually talking to each other. The same way the wall is talking, the cloth is talking to the wall. These pieces, the two hand pencil drawings, in the corner of the two altars, they're speaking to each other, and somehow Kabir is part of the conversation as well too. So I think what I'm getting at here, there's two pieces here. One is that something ordinary, and I think a lot of people will often, I'm making stereotypes about quote unquote a lot of other people, but anyways, we look for beauty, but actually what happens here, you have something that's very ordinary, very familiar, very mundane, even derided upon. I have no desire, like, I mean, I've seen these things, but suddenly become sublime, and what's most, what's most mundane becomes sublime. There's that kind of that leap that happens. And the other one is that there's a lot of dialogue happening between the different objects in the room, which makes us think: are these really objects, or do they have subjectivity? Instead.
Yeah, and the drop cloth is a thing that's never meant to be seen. It's not meant to be dyed in indigo. It's not meant to be anything. It's just a thing that is like has this very utilitarian purpose. So, for Saleh Mahmoud to even dye it in indigo, he has to prep it first. He has to mordant it. And that's not a process he would do normally. He would only do that for the thing that he's going to be then printing on, that he will be then selling. Yeah, and so the other part of this work is there's a sound piece, which is something I wanted to do with the Achadias for a long time. When I started working with the mirrors, I kind of instantly thought they need to have this sort of composition with them. So I was there in March earlier this year, and I did just some like recordings on my phone of the printing, but also all the workshops they have. All the birds come make nests on these little ledges. So you hear birds kind of constantly coming in and out. You hear, Hindi Bollywood songs like playing from other workshops. And I just wanted to kind of capture that like full environment. And then the composition was made by sort of layering all those sounds together. And it actually sounds quite, well, maybe Prasad, you can talk a little bit about the.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it's, and I don't have, I think I have video of the space. I don't have photographs. Photographs don't have sound, right? But I took video that day intentionally so I could hear it again, and I should have listened to it before. But my memory of the soundscape, of the sound piece rather, is that it sounds like someone is hammering something. That's the foreground sound. There's some sort of hammering happening, which has a rhythm to it. But if you try to keep time with it, it falls off rhythm at different points. So it has rhythm, but doesn't have rhythm. And for me, it speaks directly to the cloth, not because it's mimetic in the sense that, oh, okay, this is what is happening to the cloth. Not at all. It's more, when you look at the cloth, you see repetition of images going down in lines. And it's so interesting because, again, I've been talking about like, the different, you have one perspective, but then you spend more time with it, you see different, your perspective, your gaze changes, your perception changes. I don't say gaze, your perception changes. And so I was there with my teenage son, and he was staring at this piece, and it was really fascinating because he started pointing out, that one is my favorite. He wasn't talking about the cloth, he was talking about the one particular print. And in his view, he was able to discern differences between all these little prints, and so like the initial impression is that this is just a line, these are a series of lines of prints that are all the same, they don't mean anything. But for someone who's spending more time, they see differences. And for me, this echoes what we hear in the soundtrack, because we hear this rhythm, but it's a rhythm that falls off time, so there's variation in that rhythm. It's not a monotone, you know, rhythm. It's not repetition that starts to, you know, it's not water drop torture, right? Like it's a rhythm that's off and on time. And similarly, like, you know, you have a rhythm in the cloth that's you know, that shows repetition, but then also shows like uniqueness. And every print, in the more time you spend with it, you realize that actually every print is unique, and every print can be, like, you know, is amorphous enough to be interpreted, you know, differently, anthropomorphically or not. And it's interesting. I've always said that, like, having seen Swapnaa's work for over a decade or two, you know, I've always thought there's a techno element to Swapnaa's, you know, pieces, and this actually is a perfect time for me to kind of connect the dots that I've been looking for a long time, because techno has this rhythm. Techno in Chicago and Detroit techno has this origin of sound, of using rhythms from drum machines to sound like industrial spaces, like abandoned factories, you know. And here we have the soundscape of a factory, you know, of a textile factory, and it's a rhythm, but it's a rhythm that's falling off. It's, you know, and that's the art of techno. It sounds like it's hitting you in the head, but it's actually, it's playing with the rhythm, and this, you know, it's uncanny how the soundscape is doing that in its own way. It's not intended as techno, but it has a rhythm that falls off, and you see a similar kind of pattern visualized in the cloth as well too.
What's interesting with the block printing, so when, you know, I'm observing block printers working in these workshops, and first of all, it's like, you know, 40 degrees, and they'll work really early in the morning. They'll take their lunch around 11 a.m., come, like, have a tea break, and then come back and work, and they finish by like 3 or 4. When they're block printing, it's very meditative, and I can see them getting into this, like, this mode of, yeah, there's certain, like, ritual in the meditation, and in the, like, concentration of applying every single wood block. So part of my work, you know, Noor, you were asking about the mill owners building. So part of that work was to break with repetition, and sort of find a way, if the block printer can work counterintuitively. You know, their desire is to fill the entire piece of cloth. But what happens when you take out a print, or what happens when you take out one part of that print? And in this case, so with the drop cloths, like, you can see there is a bit of that, like, interruption and break in patterning, but there's also that kind of fullness as well. And the sound piece for me, what's, you know, that kind of techno element that comes in is, like, it's his chuckles, it's his slippers on these tiled floors as he's going back and forth. So, you know, you can hear how fast he's working. That's the thing. Like, he prints, he moves to the next spot, prints, moves to the next spot. And he's kind of rolling his, like, his trolley with the dies, and then the other parts of it, like, you kind of hear the birds come in, you sort of hear the song, like the Hindi songs come in. There's that, and, like, that is that experience, that's that layering that I'm also kind of, that I feel the drop cloths are also doing. It's that accumulation. And this is where I link to thinking about Kabir as he's no longer like a figure anymore. He's an accumulative process.
I was really excited to see that Kabir was somehow part of this project, because as a Sikh person, Kabir is, you know, he wrote half of our holy book, or, you know, texts that are attributed to him. But before because I have a lot of questions about the drawings as well and the sound, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your interest in archiving, because originally I had seen just the drop cloths, like the achadyas, as a type of archive, this accumulation of different sort of mark making that happens over time. But I feel like the whole exhibition as a project feels like that, with like the soundscape, and the drawings also, like the way they're hung, they feel like, you know, going into like a South Asian home. There's ritual images, you know, of grandparents that have passed and so on. So I feel like you're really trying to create like a sense of a particular space and practice. And I wonder if you could, yeah, elaborate on that a little bit.
I love that you're seeing it as an archive. I hadn't thought of it at all in that respect, but I wonder if, you know, I wonder about how we accumulate visual knowledge and, you know, where it archives in our minds. Like these drawings, you know, something I think about from my grandparents, you know, flat in North Bombay back in the day was like, or anyone's home would always have these like photographs, or even, you know, my grandmother used to do like cross stitch, and it was, you know, really precious. They put it really high in a frame, and then it was never the, you know, the string at the back was never done properly, so it was always kind of leaning forward in this way. I know that martyrs, for instance, like they're always kind of presented in this way as well. But I'm thinking again of like this idea of value, and how do we create our own record, or in this case, Noor, what you're saying, an archive, like how do you create your own archive of value when that doesn't have a lot of reflection in the West? So, you know, being of diaspora, South Asian diaspora, working here, just what are kind of codes or visual, what's the word, like axes that you can bring in, that you start to build in your own like library. And yeah, on one hand, it is, I guess it is an archive of thinking around value building. But I'm also wanting to create an approach to, like a new approach to thinking about mark making and drawing. And in these images, in these drawings, for instance, they're just sort of scenes from the homes of weavers in Kutch. And Sana, can you pull up a detail? So this one, for instance, is, you know, some of the weavers in a village called Bujodi, they sit in pit looms, and this is like their little altar beside their pit loom. And again, I think of that meditation of the block printer, or the meditation of the weaver, and how they create a sort of ritualistic environment around them, or how they create like a space of like high vibration around them, and how they're also adding to it. And then the one above, Sana, if you can just go to that one. So, sorry, this is not a great photograph. This is just before it was framed. So I was doing this drawing, and then at the same time researching about Kabir, and I didn't actually know what Kabir looked like. And then when I Googled him, this image, the kind of larger image at the top came up, and then I realized I was actually drawing Kabir while researching about him. And so that kind of amazing like synchronicity was happening. Yeah, and I wonder, I'm really trying to understand how we create our own archives. I guess this is really what the exercise is here in all of this, is we're creating a kind of language, a library, a set of resources, and within that creating an archive at the same time. Like I really like how you like bringing that kind of approach into this.
Yeah, because ornamentation is also something I'm really excited about. But when I started reading and, you know, researching this project, archives were just such a big, like, was like the main way I sort of entered into this project. And so I'm surprised that it feels like you're focused on other elements of the project and thinking about archives now, because also, go ahead.
Can you talk about how you see it as an archive?
Yeah, just how, first of all, it was just the job clause. That felt like an archive, like a repository of different actions that have taken place. And also trying to like archive like a subaltern community in a way that hasn't had books dedicated to it, who haven't written their own records. And so their body, I could feel their body being sort of recorded, their body movements. But then also the element of sound, drawings, and these images that look like their own archives, like ritualistic archives, things that are important to them. And so, yeah, I think that's how I see the whole project as like a type of archive that you are trying to shift, like what we think about when we think about archives. It's not necessarily a dusty building, but it can be approached through a visual text, textile based, sound based, and drawing based way. But is it resonating a little bit with you?
Oh, I think that's so interesting. Like that, you use the word repository. And when I think back to this idea of images making themselves, like these kind of scenes from homes are very much images that have made themselves. They're, there's an accumulation of things. There's a little flashlight. You see the mobile phone plug. You see a mirror. There's a comb. The chair. In the other image, you have like various gods and goddesses that are being represented. Those are definitely, I'm curious about how, if we can think of archive as something that's like an active archive, not just living, but an active archive, and something that can also shift. So it's not fixed in nature, and can continue to shift. That, Sana, if you go to the next image again, so the altar next to this pit loom, this is going to continue to change as altars do. And, in all of my kind of trips to India, I'm always looking at how like a little shrine will appear by a roadside or in between two branches, in the middle of like a crazy busy intersection. This kind of idea of like the being added to, the additive nature, that someone might come along and put, a coconut down or a light, or we'll just continue to add to it. So perhaps this idea of the archive becomes something that's like, it's an activated space, it's an activated archive.
But then I feel like that's where the mirrors and the drop cloths also come in. And the wind that you mentioned and Prasad mentioned as well, that these objects are moving and full of life, and the sort of your experience in the space changes as well. So I think you've intuitively sort of brought that into the presentation as well.
I want to jump in for a second. I think I appreciate what you're saying about the archive, and I know archive work is so important these days, especially for recovery and for memory making and that kind of thing. But I'm gonna challenge it just a little bit, just looking from a different, because for me, an archive connotes, it's like a repository of objects, and it's a place of it, and it has a lot of stuff. And I think a lot of us, it connotes, dead objects for me. And for me, like, having experienced the exhibition, it's, me, everything is very minimal here. There's minimalism, there's lots of space, and everything's actually quite alive. And I like this idea, and to kind of harmonize this together. There's this, we can look at rethink archive as as a living archive. But for me, it's very much a space of imagination. As old school as that might sound, like it's really an imaginative space, because it's not even, with the exception of Acharya, a lot of it isn't found objects. It's like, like archive is a place where we find things that have been stored, and here there's a lot of there's a lot of creation happening, a lot of newness, and again, lots of lots of interactivity happening between all the elements in the room, including, you know, the both intended and unintended, and of course the the role of the viewer, the attender, you know, the participant, you know, who's entering the space. So I just wanted to kind of I really appreciate the whole discussion on archives. But I do, for me, it's, you know, archive means such a you know, it's as the scholarly side of me loves to go to archives because I can dig and do all that kind of stuff. The artist side of me has no interest whatsoever. You know, so there's a bit of a conflict for me in on that level. Um, if I may, I wanted to come back to the Kabir piece, but I think Noor wants. I see a thought bubble coming. So why don't you go ahead first?
Yeah, I just wanted to, you also agree with that. I feel like archives are, you know, often seen as dead depositories and very colonial institutions as well, be they like physical spaces or just ideas. But I think for me, it's also this practice of collecting, you know, that I see in archives, and I see in this project as well, this decision to collect and put different anecdotes, images, experiences in relation to each other. And that's what it really feels like. That's what this, like how I see this project as an archive, not necessarily as dead fixed things that are supposed to tell one singular story, but just what collecting means in that sense.
Are you thinking about like this kind of idea of like archiving the impossible in a way, or archiving the unseen, and the often ignored?
Yeah, and I wanted to also understand a little bit about the history of the workers as well, but I think that's going to be a huge conversation, a different conversation. But I really want to hear more about Kabir. So Prasad, please continue.
No problem. And I think, yeah, to kind of, you know, bridge this a little bit more is, I mean, it's very much an archive of the new, you know, and no one's going to walk into the space, into the exhibition, finding, you know, objects of Kabir. These are all things that are inspired by Kabir, but they're new creations. And I'm going to, you know, the literary side of me is going to jump right to the, you know, we talked about the images, you know, the pencil drawings, but for me, a big one is actually the text that is written on one of the walls. I don't know if Noor, if you had a chance to read, there's a text, or if you have an image of it. I have an image. I can read it out if anyone wants. Kabir sang his poems by composing them orally. He recited them to other weavers. He sang about the universe as a textile. His poems began to move, to travel on the tongues of sadhus, merchants, traders, and pilgrims. They traveled east, west, and north. His poems began accumulating bhashas and bolis. They were sung in folk traditions. They still are. Eventually, they gathered scripts and were written on paper. Kabir is not a singular persona. He's an unarchivable myth. He belongs to everyone. He's a chorus of authors. He's a chorus of centuries, a chorus that continues to move, never secured to a spot, an accumulation of layers and sound. An endless piece of unstitched cloth, unfurled, draped over a body, taken off. It falls on the ground, gathers earth and dust, and is then folded, run through hands, and unfolded yet again. Kabir was a weaver. Kabir was a cotton weaver. He was a subaltern. He was a julaha or kori or both or neither. And so it's interesting because it's all sentences, but for me, this is very much a poem. And I read this as a poem because Kabir was a poet, you know, and Kabir is venerated, like, you know, as a saint, as a sant, which then gets anglicized as a saint, right? And he's venerated on this level. There's so many poets from this period, you know, between the 8th and the 17th centuries, right? Basically from the Alvars in Tamil Nadu up to Sikhism. There's so many people who we call mystics and saints today, but they were poets. They started off as language creators. And part of the magic about Bhakti poetry, they call it Bhakti poetry as in devotional poetry, but you know, if you're reading, let's say, A.K. Ramanujan, who writes, you know, and Dilip Chitre, these are two of the great translators of Bhakti poetry. For them, this is literature. And part of the literariness is actually, these are poems written in the people's language, not in Sanskrit. And they're they're poems speaking, they're meant from people speaking to other people. They're not just poems about, the poet speaking to God, and so I look at this as a type of bhakti poem, and also at the same time, not a bhakti poem. I have to be true to Kabir's spirit here. It is, and it isn't, and it's a bhakti poem in the sense that it's spoken in vernacular English. It's talking. It's written, but it's written, in a way that is vernacular. It's meant for any ordinary person to come in and understand the communication. And at the same time, on that level, it's not a bhakti poem. It's not something that is meant to be. It's not an act of devotion or worship or venerate. I mean, there's pride and awe in Kabir here, but it's not a religious poem in that way. Like it's not even an ode to Kabir. It comes close, but it's not. It's something about it holds back, and it's so. Why did I bring this up? Yeah. Anyways, I think the poem is a key piece that on one level, and this is what I think. There's a lot for me to say here, but it's just a piece of writing. But on one level, the writing brings all the objects together in the room. Which is for me is interesting because again, I'm not an art person. I come from a literature background, and I'm a writer, and so it's interesting for me to see text rather than object or anything visually. Is being used to bring all the elements together. I love this line here. He sang about the universe as a textile. There's a Sufi saint who a lot of musicians in the West, Hazrat Inayat Khan, he has this line, the world is sound, and you think about other people would say, no, the world is text. Everything is a text. The world is text. But here we have Kabir saying, no, the universe is a textile. So it makes us think about those relationships. But I think it's the charm of Kabir here. The charm is that he has a spiritual view, but at the same time he doesn't want to be venerated as one either. And so there's that element of uncertainty and also of negation. I'm Kabir. I'm going to do all kinds of things, but I'm not going to tell you what I am. Just like the piece, just like the whole exhibition, it's not trying to land on one spot.
Yeah,
I have more to say, but I want to have dialogue.
just to say, before you speak, what I love is that how Kabir has become. He belongs to everybody. He's like a shifting figure. It's like, for me, he's like the mirrors. It's like it could exist or it couldn't exist, doesn't matter anymore. It's that he's because the poems can have the ability to adapt and change and be added to. There is like a certain set of poems for sure, but they can accumulate. I love that idea that they're like translated into so many different languages. They have different syntaxes and grammars, and that they've traveled. They've taken trains. They've taken they've taken roads. They've taken like waterways. Like this is so interesting to me is that it's not just language, but it's sound, right? And so then it's like, okay, it's a figure of Kabir, but it's also, it's a shifting ground for me.
Yeah. I had a thought, but I think Noor has an insight. Go ahead.
No insights. I had like what's that phrase? Like I have goosebumps when you were reading the text.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah, it's I really wish I had the chance to see the exhibition in person, like really see all these elements. I'm going to Toronto, Hamilton in like a few weeks, so I didn't make it in time. But yeah, what a complete, just like intense experience. The universe is a textile, you said, right?
That's what she wrote.
Yeah, but that's the text.
That's what he wrote.
That's what he wrote.
That's what he said, yeah. And this piece that we're looking on the screen here, this is a weaving in plastic. So this NGO that I work with who I've been working with, Saleh Mahmed, they also have begun this recycled plastic weaving project, in which they're making bags and pencil cases and all these kinds of things. And I thought, I've been doing these kind of text drawings for ages, and I thought, let me just try this as a text as well. So this is made from recycled, or from biscuit wrappers. So they have a whole process of, like, taking it from the garbage dump, sanitizing them, putting them on an actual spindle, like through a charka, like through a spinning wheel, and then actually weaving it on a loom. So I am using this kind of whatever, I guess, a global material to make this new weaving that is really speaking about how Kabir was like the bottom of the bottom. Like he was, he might have been Julaha, which is the Muslim name for weavers, or he might have been Kori, which is the Hindu name for weavers. And they were both at like the bottom kind of caste, but the Julahas were also considered outsiders by the higher Hindu caste. So I was thinking of that idea of like this figure who is, the subaltern, manages to have this incredible centuries fold outreach through song and through poetry, and who's obviously also kept intentionally illiterate. Like that to me is so fascinating.
Are we okay for time?
Oh yeah,
We've got a few more minutes. I think we'll save like 5 more minutes and then wrap up.
I want to jump in just on some Kabir on that note, in terms of caste. We've been talking about subalterns, and how the people who work in this tradition of textile making, and Kabir himself as being kind of subaltern figures. But my interpretation of this exhibition is that the acharya is the subaltern in the room, and I'm anthropomorphizing it a little bit, but for me, the acharya is a subaltern object, and I'm going to take a risk here. I'm going to say it's even a Dalit object. I don't want to call it a Dalit, but it's a Dalit object, right? It's signified this way for me because this is, you're talking of this is the cloth that collects waste. It collects residue, and there's this history of how so many Dalit communities are relegated to this position of carrying the waste, and it's interesting because acharya is not I want to put it, it's a heterotopic object at the same time too, like in the sense that it's the object that is unseen but that makes everything else possible. There is no society without the Dalit, right? There's no society without that whoever it is that does that labor of collecting the waste. And it's interesting because this does connect back to the silver text, that's made of what did you say it was made of? The silver
biscuit wrappers.
Biscuit wrappers. Again, it's made of waste, and something is created out of it, right? And acharya as a word. I mean, I'm not a Sanskritist, but what little I know is that a is negation. So this means that object is not acharya. If I Google acharya, I will see all kinds of fabrics. I will not. If I Google acharya, I will only see this exhibition. Right, and so the point is that this is a subaltern object in the sense of not that it was made by subalterns, but it's the piece that everyone wants to forget about, but it's a piece that also heterotopically makes everything possible.
So in the castes and the Shudras, so you have like the artisans who are part of that caste, along with seashell carvers, potters, so that to me it's insane that like the most like creative and the innovators are at the bottom. Like these are the people who are inventing, they're inventing new processes all the time and new methods of working, and they're inventing better methods in their workshops for just making everything run better. but yet they're still considered at the bottom. And Kabir was also a cotton weaver, not a silk weaver. So he was not allowed, you know what I mean? He wasn't even allowed to like work with the best material. So that's also interesting for me.
That's part of the
and-
caste dynamic too, right? In terms of like
Yeah.
how the great artists, you know, like let's say the great writers are all Brahmins, right? Sanskrit Brahmin writers, but you know, but those were considered Shudra, right? And Dalit is not Shudra, right? There's a difference, but you know,
yeah.
right, the outer caste, right? But the Shudras, they're not considered artists; they're considered craftspeople. So that whole dynamic that we see here in the English language, you know, speaking world of you know of the artist, who's an artist and who's a craftsperson, what is ornament and what is art, and you know, and Kabir is a perfect metaphor here to explode those binaries.
Yeah, as someone who was trying to also get out of the Hindu caste system, or as
Right.
part of that Bhakt tradition of wanting to. Noor, do you know, or can you talk a little bit like sort of Kabir and like the kind of founding of Sikhism?
Wow, that's a big question. No, so the reason I was really interested in like the discussion around Kabir is because I don't know so much about him. It's his name has been mentioned in conversation with like, you know, my parents, my grandparents, aunts. Kabira ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਦੇ ਆ, Kabir ਨੇ ਆਹ ਲਿਖਿਆ, you know, Kabir ਨੇ ਉਹ ਲਿਖਿਆ, Kabir ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਹੈ, you know, all these phrases around Kabir said this, Kabir said that. And so I'm just really excited to learn a little bit more about the history around this figure as well, and the myth making around him, because his name is also mentioned in the Guru Granth Sahib. And so many of the poems in the text are attributed to him. And so, yeah, I'm really just interested in like learning more. There's not much I can tell you about him. But I think like the comments you made around caste and Kabir's origins as well, you know, tie in with Sikhism, how originally it was supposed to be a casteless society. And maybe that's why we did look up to Kabir and included so much of his poetry. But you know, like other religions in South Asia, like caste has crept in, class and all of that has crept in over time. So I think this idea of castelessness is kind of performative at this point, and, you know, empty from what was originally sort of hoped for in Sikhism. So yeah, that's all I can sort of add to this conversation.
Yeah, I think of, I mean, all of this as an exercise is like, it's sort of a way of thinking about emancipation, or a way of thinking out of binaries, or, you know, I like Prasad, exactly what you said, this heterotopic space that actually like allows for everything to be possible, but is actually free of everything as well. Yeah.
It's interesting, you know, Kabir is hard, you know, like it's like Noor, I fully relate. Like once you get these little nuggets of information about someone like this, you want to learn more. And then especially if we can bring this back to diaspora now, like, you know, being here, I think, I mean, Marathi is my first language, but I don't use it to think. I use English to think. So for me to find any information about someone like Kabir, I have to use English. But then there's that problem, because I have to then think critically about what information I'm getting from. I can't, I'm not in a position where I can simply trust what I read. I'm in a position of skepticism for whatever I read. I want to connect this though to, you know, to the pencil drawings of the altars. You know, there's a very small image on the one on the left, you know, the one that has the Gandhi image at the top. It's very bold and very easy to see for everybody, but there's also a little small picture of Shirdi Sai Baba, who was a 20th century saint mystic from Maharashtra. I'm from a family of Shirdi Sai Baba devotees. He's not a poet, but he's also like Kabir in the sense that he was a figure who tried to bring, who challenged the Muslim Hindu communal, you know, thing, you know, this thing of ethnic tensions between, you know, Hindu and Muslim communities, and but it's like Kabir, you know, if you these figures are Sanskritized. You know, they're claimed they are radicals at one point in their history, and then they are Sanskritized. They're absorbed into what do you call it? They're Sanskritized. They're nationalized. They're Hindiized, right? And I'm not saying Hindu, but Hindiized, right? And I'm sure in some contexts they may be even, you know, Islamicized in an orthodox way, because, you know, Muslims claim these groups as well too. And then of course they're modernized. They're capitalized. They're subject. Like you can go anywhere in India and you can buy little like things for sale that and buy objects that are for sale that will claim to, like, you know, give you some sort of spiritual healing because it's somehow connected to, you know, one of these figures. But I think the smallness, especially the smallness of Shirdi Sai Baba in that image, it speaks to this whole problem, and that is that if you really want to see it, like the history that you want, that's those of us who are just, let's say, in social justice, and it's both diasporically, but then also like in a South Asian context, in the context of Hindutva, you know, which claims these figures in very particular ways, you have to really dig and look to the small details but you have to also, you can't just work as an object, it has to be intertextual. And it's a search. It's an ongoing search, which is the only thing I think that parallels the spiritual search. It is endless. It's not just, there's no destination here. It's an endless loom, to go back to the weaving.
Thank you guys so much. I hate to interrupt such a fruitful conversation, but we're just rounding out on time now. So yeah, I want to make maybe room for any last thoughts before I end the recording. If there's anything.
I just want to thank you, Prasad and Noor. Just you both brought up so many, just like you've opened up the exhibition in the way that, that I'm kind of thinking about in all these like really, I guess, for lack of a better word, like intuitive ways of working, but also wanting to storytell through all of these different kind of nodes, and the challenge is like, how do you kind of prep your viewer for all of these like reference points that I'm making that are really specific, but ultimately I'm still wanting to make a space of that kind of seduction and like beauty and ornament. So thank you so much. Thank you both.
And I just want to jump in, and for anyone who does want additional context for the show, we will be releasing the publication at the same time as this video too. So that's available for mail or for people who want to come by the gallery and grab it as well. It's got some great photos in it.